I want to continue and build upon what I said last week about the very unusual profile of this community, the Ashkenazic community, especially when it starts in the High Middle Ages, which is what they call it, the 9, 10, 1100s, and comes together in unique ways. And I want to focus on some of those before we proceed from there to talk about the actual Masa'ei Tzlab, about the actual Crusades. And I tried to explain last week the kind of clouded past in terms of details, where we come from. Nobody knows exactly where the Ashkenazi Jews first arrived and when precisely. We have a general kind of idea, but we know what it eventually morphs into. And one of the key aspects of this culture, which lasts for 1,000 years, is that Ashkenaz is the land of minhagim and piyutim, the land of customs and of special prayers that people make up and stick into the siddur, which when they tried to do that in the 19th century, they called it Reform Judaism, because they were motivated perhaps by different ideas. But when in the 9th century, not the 19th century, then it's something quite different. I want you to understand that what we're talking about is, here are communities in France and Germany in which somebody will come up with a new poem and they'll stick it right in the middle of Shemona Esrei, right in the middle of the Krishma, right in the middle of the Birchas Krishma, which from a purely Talmudic sensibility breaks the rules. And in spite of what I just said, we're going to do it anyway. And the reason we're going to do it anyway is because I want to get across over here. This is a community which is very pious, but they decide when to do the rules and when not to, because Gedolim understand that sort of thing. And who's the Gadol over here? My mother, my father, my brother, my grandparents. And if they did it, they knew what they're doing. And people live through times when this is happening. This phenomenon, for anyone who's at all familiar with, as I say, the normative halachic sensibilities, is really remarkable, and it bespeaks a rather extraordinary veneration of ancestors and of their own contemporary Gedol, big rabbis as they saw it, and paitanim, and poets. Many of the great poems are put together by the big rabbis, many put together by chazanim and others. And yet, the public says, this is really cool. This would be great in the middle of Ava Rabbah or something, right in the middle of before the Shema, or right in the middle of Shemona Esrei, and we're going to do it. And not only that, but then it becomes hardened in cement. This is the way one does it, and anyone who leaves them out is actually the one who's doing something wrong. The best example of the kind of remarkable aspect of this is, when you take things to its extreme. If anybody ever looks in the Modim Balacha by Rav Zevin, I'm sure many are familiar with that classic work, and in his, and he knows everything, and in his essay on Purim, he has a number of essays on Purim, he talks about the old tradition of getting drunk, because that's what it is. It's an old tradition. Aside from the Talmudic side of the discussion, it's just something that went on for hundreds of years, long time, whether you like it or not. And it was certainly part and parcel of the culture of Jews long ago, 1,000 years ago, so much, and Ashkenaz as well as others, so much so that it enters into the siddur. And Rav Zevin, listen to this. You have over here a piyut, that's a religious poem inserted into the prayers, Shenichnas b'machzer vitri, which is in the Machzer Vitri, which is compiled by the son-in-law, the student of Rashi. So you're talking about long ago, a very old and authoritative Ashkenaz, and a lot of it has to do with Zmiros and Slichos and the type of things that you say over there. In other words, where he came from, very Yekish. They really cared that you should add this extra little Slicha or Piyut or something in this occasion, and he interprets what they mean when the poetry is a little bit extensive. And here we have for Ma'ariv, but towards Ma'ariv Lepurim. In other words, on Purim night in Shul, when you're davening Ma'ariv, which is a halachic thing, and these are German and French Jews, and Rav Zevin himself says this is remarkable. Here's how it goes. In other words, you basically go something like this: and then before you say Baruch Atah Hashem Ma'ari Ravim, then they all recite Leil Shekurim Hu Alaylo, and tonight's not Leil Shemurim. To drink and party with wine. Purim al Shem Pornik or Begilo. Hamariv Aravim. Okay? Can you imagine it? Okay? Then when you get to the next one, Balayla Hazeh Yishkuru Kol Yitzurim. This and right? And somebody obviously made the. If you're telling me that this was done for what they call in the yeshiva a shtick in a Purim play, or at a Purim Suda when someone's making a grauman up, I understand that. If you tell me they're doing this in the tefillah, and yeah, right? Cursed is the person who drinks water, who raises his hand to drink mayim hamarim, the cursed water, on this night. Baruch atah Hashem, ohev amo Yisrael. Can you imagine that? Or Purim yishtu yayin kol ro'ehu achi lo yake ish Yisraehu. Right? Everybody should drink till they can't tell who the other one is. Anybody drinks the wine from the barrel knows he's really swilling away. He's not chayiv if he does neshech and tarbis, right? And then Baruch atah Hashem Goal Yisrael, and so forth, and so on and so forth. Now, that's an extreme example, but it brings home my point. This is a time, I don't know how it got written, and I don't know how it got in there, but if I told you, that's what Rashi did in his thing, that's what we do. And the sort of counter-argument is this right, is it wrong? How do you balance this against normative, halachic practice? If we could use this, right? It's a funny world. This is, that of course is true also, but we do what we do. And this unbelievable self-confidence in the rectitude of everything that they do is absolutely characteristic, as I said, of the land of minhagim and the land of piyutim, so much so that you end up with a world in which I will not go quite so far as to say the minhag is more important than the din, but I will. Right? Which reminds me of a famous story I saw once from my favorite heretic, Dr. Louis Jacobs in London, where he said that this happened in London in the 1950s, 40s or 50s. And a guy didn't want to sit Shiva, only for 3 days. Now it's more common. That time it wasn't so common. And must have been a German, British Jew, something like that. They didn't know what to do. His mother died. 7 days. He wants to sit for 3 days. And so they got a hold of some Choshev Rov, that's the way he told the story, in London, I don't know, or Bromsky, somebody like that. And he went to the guy, tried to explain to him. He says, you got to sit 7 days. That's the din. It's not me, it's the din. And the guy said, that's the din? I thought it was a minhag. If I knew it was a din, I wouldn't sit Shiv at all. Right? Meaning, if it's a minhag, then you do it. That's all he did is take to ridiculous extremes. Something has its origins in the 9 and 1000s. Okay, we're not used to it because we come from now the current frum culture has a different sensibility because it's gone through many, metamorphoses, and it's reflected. And the difference of what I'm talking about is reflected again in two famous stories that they say about the Shagas Aryeh, who was the most famous rabbi, certainly, or one of the most famous of the 18th century, and one of the big Litvish rabbim of all times. It's coming from a much more Talmudic and Lithuanian sensibility, and he very famously, in his career, you have to understand, he was looked upon as the man. The Vilna Gaon looked up to him and all that. And in the course of his career, he eventually became the rabbi in Metz, which is a very important community in Ashkenaz. At that time, like now, it became part of France, but it's German Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, old community. Next week, when we get to it, that's where the first violence in the Crusades happened, the Jews in Metz. And he comes there, as before Shavuos, very famous story, and it's a question about Akdamus. I think everybody here knows what I'm talking about. Akdamus, the famous poem that you recite in the morning of Shavuos. Many people, many people, if they go through the night, so maybe they're half asleep when they're saying it, and that's a compliment to them. But you all seriously know what I'm talking about. And the Akdamus is from the 1000s from Ashkenaz. The Akdamus was composed by a chazan who was a contemporary of Rashi. I might have lived in Mainz, actually. And it's an Aramaic. And it's a wonderful poem. That's what it is. It's a piyut about the glory of God in heaven. He describes in very anthropomorphic terms. And that's one big theme about there. And the other theme is, and once again, in the context of the incipient Crusades and the atmosphere that pervades Ashkenaz during these years, the second half of the poem is all about how the nations of the world, the Christians, notice, the Gentiles, are trying to seduce the Jews and say, come on over to our side. And the Besulas Bas Yisrael, the Jewish people, so I guess, you got to be kidding. In other words, besides everything else, you're a loser. You get it? If you yidatu chakmin le beishtamodu, so if you only knew who my friend was, right? Who our one is, and you know what you have can't match what he can offer, and all that. So it's a very powerful poem. But and I got no problem with it. But it's recited in Shachris, or when they read the Torah, and the question always is, in our world, you call someone up to read the Torah, and then where do you actually recite this? Now, I just showed you they had no trouble in those days even having a drinking poem in the middle of Krishma or something like that. So the old minhag was to do it in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah, in the middle of laning. And so basically you call up a Kohen, and he says, Baruch Hashem Baruch, and all that, and then they start the laning. And then in the middle of everything, the guy starts saying, Adam, and everybody does that. I have no trouble with that, but it's what you call a hefsek. You understand? It's an interruption. And if you have a Talmudic sensibility, you say, that's not right. You're supposed to have an uninterrupted reading of the Torah. That's the rules. Look at the Gemara. And so, Shagas Aryeh, who is this Lithuanian big rabbi, he comes in there and he says, what you do is, you call the guy up, and then you do the Akdamus, you recite the poem, and then you do Baruch Hu and all the rest of it. And they said, this is Metz. For 1,000 years, we do it our way. You call the guy up, he has the aliyah, they start in the middle of the laning, and then you do the poem. And he said, well, this is just wrong. And he says, this is the way we do it. And he says, I'm telling you, I'm the new rabbi, and I'm telling you, you can't do it this way. And they said, you can say whatever you want, that's the way we're doing it. Right? This is my Bubby did it, my Zadie did it, my grandfather, all the rest of it. Don't tell me, this is it. He walked out. He was a rabbi there for 27 years. He never walked again into the shul. He has a little minion, and everybody was happy. You understand? And the point is like this, is the irresistible force and the immovable object. Right? Who wins? And it's a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. They knew he's a big deal and all the rest of it, obviously. What's that got to do with anything? But this is how we do it here. And that is the Ashkenaz sort of thing. That story has been parodied. The way I heard it when I was young, and I saw it written, and maybe true, you never know, but I think it's a parody, goes when they, Shagas Aryeh, who, again, I can't overemphasize how big a person he was in the learning, comes to town, so they told him, you're now the new Rav, the new Av Beis Din, and these German Ashkenaz Gil, they took the customs very seriously, and they said, here's the Pinkas HaKahal. This is the official record book of the community, and anyone who gets elected to be the new rabbi here, which is not many people, gets to add 2 paragraphs. He can add 2 takonos or something to the customs of the community. And he writes in there, lo tignov, lo signal, so he puts in the 10 commandments. And the reason it's like this, if it's a minute, maybe you'll do it. You understand? Now I don't know if it really happened, but it's a battle of the 2 sensibilities. And if you want to understand the type of people who are akshonim, the way I'm describing it, then you want to go into time. Hold that thought, because they're going to take this into the Crusader violence. They'll be surrounded by overwhelming force, and they'll say this, we don't move. I'd rather kill myself, literally, than give it to you. The men and the women and the children. It's that kind of mentality. This is what we do, this is how we are, and nothing moves us. Okay? So it's a very powerful sort of image that emerges over here. And I can tell you that after the Crusades, the piyutim and their halachic appropriateness, and depending where you put, where they go into the prayer book, that is not questioned anymore, because the people who are writing this are very often martyrs or survivors of massacres and they've, so to speak, earned their rights to stick anything in wherever they want, and that's the way it goes. So this is the origins of what you call the Yakasha kind of a culture and mentality, which has deep roots, as you see over here, going back already into the 1000s and perhaps even beforehand. Two very good examples of what I'm talking about are one well-known and one less well-known, is Rashi, who is an Ashkenazic Jew in France, living at the time I'm talking about in the 1000s. He lives from 1040 to 1106. He lived through the First Crusade. And the very first Rashi in the Shas, in the Talmud, many know, the very first Mishnah says, when do you read Shema? says Shema. And, okay. And what does the Mishnah say? Many are familiar with this. Up to Tzeisek Kochavim. You can't read Shema until the stars come out. No, if you want to be Yotzei, the Krishma. And Rashi immediately says, we don't. We daven at 7 o'clock Marav or something like that, at 7:30, whatever. Now, it doesn't occur to Rashi to say like this, maybe we're all wrong, the Talmud says you're supposed to do it after Marav. Of course you're not wrong. This is what we do. But where did it come from? I don't know, but this is what we do. Right? And therefore, he immediately says like this, well, anybody who will remember this, I guess you're Yotzei the mitzvah Krishma when you do Krishma Lamita. You say it later anyway. You get it? But to say, gee, maybe, the emperor has no clothes and maybe we've all been davening Marav at the wrong time for the last 100 or 200 years. What, are you crazy? Of course not. Rabbenu Gershom davened Marav too early. You see? That mentality doesn't extend into Sfarad. It's very interesting. If you study the Sephardic culture, and I'm talking about the high culture that you find in the rabbinic literature, very often at the time they say, this is what they're doing until now, but now that they discovered that this was a mistake, they'll switch it. Many times this happens in Sfarad. They're much more flexible and malleable. In the Ashkenaz, the reverse. Okay? Here I stand and here I stand. And another one I saw myself just the other day, I'll share this with you. We were doing it a couple weeks ago in Shul on Shabbos, where just a little point, and it's from the 19th century, but it'll be exactly an example of what I'm talking about. In the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in the bottom, that's what you call the Shar Mitzion Ba'alocha. Some know that's a collection of different responses and things like this. And the question is about, the Hasidim have the custom of going to the mikveh, the men, on Shabbos. And the thing is, what is hot water or cold water? And according to the Talmudic law, you're not supposed to ever go on Shabbos in hot water. It's called the Gzeres HaBalanim, Gzeres HaMerchatzos. But here you are in Hungary or Poland in the 1800s, and all these people going to the mikveh. Man, I repeat, on the daytime of Saturday. And is it hot water or cold water? And he quotes over here just a very short paragraph where he says, Kosev and Mishnah Bura. The Mishnah Bura is, of course, the Chavetz Chaim, a Litvak, the normative, process. And he says, the tzarech lizar b'Shabbos tiyam mikvah rak poshrin dim lo kein also litbobo. The water cannot be hot. The most can be lukewarm. If it's hot water, you're already running into Talmudic prohibitions. It's a din against the law. Awal b'tshuvas divrei Chaim. But if you look in the response from the Sanzer Rebbe, right, Reb Chaim Halberstam, one of the most famous Hasidic Rebbes of all time, okay, who lived in the 1800s, who was a Misnagid who converted to Hasidism and then became a big Rebbe. So he said, Mater litbol gam b'chamin. He says you can do it. You can go in hot water even to men for the mikvah. Because of the afal gav to mitzad din aser, and here's what he writes. He says, even though halachically it's prohibited, kvarnogu mikol magum kvarnogu kol gedoli derena heta babhanach le'Yisrael. But we do it, so it's okay. Okay? You imagine someone would do it in our community, so to speak. You understand? But he's saying like this, big Rebbes did it and other people like that. That's very Ashkenazic. You get it? If the Baal Shem Tov did, and the others would do. I don't know why. They know what they're doing. Leave me alone. And that's, even though that's 19th century and it's Galicia and all the rest of it, but it's really not. It's eingewurzelt. It really has its roots much deeper, as I say before, in this very interesting Ashkenazic mentality. And as I say before, do not be surprised next week when you see the Ashkenazic Jews faced with overwhelming odds and unbelievable violence, but they will not do what the Jews in Sfarad in Spain do, which is submit to conversion under terrible physical pressure. But to them, their life is cheap. right? They'll say, kill me. No one to do it. In fact, you don't have to kill me. I'll kill myself. Very, very, very powerful motif. A second very, very interesting aspect of this medieval Ashkenaz is rather unexpected, the role of women. We find in Ashkenaz, especially in the 9, 10, 1100s, that the social reality, which is the of tiny groups of Jews living literally in a hostile sea, cannot fail to have the most powerful and perhaps unexpected consequences in the social and even the religious realm. Now, what does all those fancy words mean? It's always one or two Jewish families live in a whole town where nobody else is Jewish. It's not New York. It's not Bar Park or Bnei Brak or Lakewood or anything like that, where you have large, compact Jewish communities. That you may have in Sfarad in Spain to some degree in the Middle Ages. Last year we were in Toledo, big, beautiful town. There was a large Jewish community, 3,000 Jews. That was considered humongous once upon a time. Okay, most of the times it was smaller. And in Ashkenaz, it's 10 families here, 2 families there, 1 family here, 3 families there. Very common to have a community in which is a minyan altogether. You know, nobody can afford to be missing. It's out of this community you get those famous questions, what if you have 9? Can you count a kid with a chumash and all that? This is the communities and the realities out of which this exists. Some people here, I don't know everyone here, some people may have come originally from small towns in America or elsewhere, and you might be a little bit familiar with what I'm talking about. There's an entirely different dynamic. I'm sure you can understand this if you haven't experienced it. There's an entirely different dynamic between living in Baltimore here and now, right now, when you're in the middle of a large, compact community, or Cleveland or Lakewood or someplace like that, versus living, on the eastern shore of Maryland or out in the middle of nowhere, as sometimes you find a shochet or somebody has to do. You see? And the point I'm trying to make is that in that environment, every person counts, the men, the women, the children. And the notion of he's more important than she is or something like this, it just doesn't match the social reality of it. To keep the Jewish family going and staying Jewish, the man is choshev, the women is also very choshev, in fact, even more choshev than the man very often. And this cannot but be reflected in cultural changes in which they'll say, maybe the hierarchy in Judaism formally is that the man is first or this, that, and the other. But the reality isn't, without changing the rules, the reality is changed because of the social situation. And therefore, it expresses itself in unexpected ways, even in the religious realm. So that's one very, very important point to keep in mind. You understand? You can't say this is an all-male sort of thing. There's no such thing as an all-male community when there's 5 or 10 families or 20 families anywhere. You need everybody, okay? And everybody is very the contribution that every single person in the community makes is very important. And very often there could be a woman or whatever that her contribution is more important than that of the other people. It just is. And so here I have an old culture, 3,000 and some years old, which is more heavily male oriented, and is challenged by the realities, the very interesting realities of the new environment in which they find themselves. That's one point. The second point is the perhaps unexpected consequences, social consequences of child marriages. In Ashkenaz, as elsewhere, the conditions in the Middle Ages were such, and the predisposition of Jewish culture was such, that they all go for child marriages. I'm sure everybody knows your own grandparents or great-grandparents or great-grandparents all got married when they were 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, if you take the trouble to go back to Europe, wherever. This is the way it was once upon a time. And this has many reasons. The Talmud is sort of in favor of not child marriages, but young teens, for various reasons. The Tosafists, the people who live in France, in Ashkenaz during this time, some people who know how to learn may remember the beginning Tosas in the beginning of second parak of Kedushin, where it says you're not supposed to marry a katana, someone who's under 12 years old, but the Bali Tosa, but we do it now because if I have a daughter and I have a dowry and I have the money now, if I wait till she's 12, 13, 15 years old, the money might not be there and she won't be able to get married, because in those days without a dowry you're not going to get married. You understand? And so, right along, this is what we do. Once again, it becomes the minhag, which breaks the din. Now, think about what I'm about to say. The typical life, I'm giving you social history now. The typical life pattern of a Jewish couple, a responsible Jewish couple, in the time of Rashi, let's say, or afterwards, and a Christian middle class also, is the following. Here's a couple, they're married, they have, let's say, for argument's sake, 4 kids. You're a good parent, good mother, good father. You want the best for your kids. It's not college and that sort of thing. You want the best. What do you do? And the answer is, you scrape away whatever money you can, and I'm just making a figure up. Let's say it's a prosperous merchant by the standards of the Middle Ages. So let's say, for argument's sake, I'm just making a figure up. I have 4 kids, and I'm able to put $75,000 down for each kid. It's not a fortune. It's something, right? But that's what I have. He's a merchant, she's a this. That's what they have. 2 sons, 2 daughters, let's say. So you have 2 daughters. You have $75,000 for each daughter. Now, what's their future going to be? If you want a secure economic future, the parents think along the following lines. I got to marry her off to a boy whose family also be able to put up some kind of money, so that when they grow up, there'll be something there for them to make a living off of. I want to find someone who can at least put up 75 for his kid or something like that. And so you'll have a young couple, and we're going to marry them off young, who will start off with a nest egg of 150. You don't give kids the money, obviously. So you have that invested. You take that 150, and you put it in what you call a very conservative investment, which you hope to God will not fizzle out. And let's say, for example, you have a cousin, a relative, an uncle, a reputable business person who's got a good business going, and so you invest 150, or maybe you're prudent, you invest it in 5 different places, pieces of it. That's how they did it. And the idea is you want to take a piece of that off, by the way, and you're going to spend that on the young man's education. What is the education? If he's the unusual type, he's going to be a rabbi, someone will get that small, go to yeshiva. If not, then he got to have a living. He got to make a parnasa. Now, the boy and the girl I'm talking about are 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, generally speaking. So tell me what you do with a 14-year-old. Okay? And the answer is they got to learn something. How are you going to learn something? I'm going to apprentice him to a relative or someone that agrees. And I'm going to give that guy 5,000, 10,000, whatever. And he'll start him from the bottom up in the fur trade, in the lumber trade, in the jewelry business, perhaps in the wheat, in the shipping. And you learn the business from the ground up. The expectation, of course, is written in beforehand in contracts is, once you learn this, you're not going to go into competition with me. So what are you going to do? You're going to move somewhere else. Then I'll have a network already. If I have 5 kids that I trained, and this one moves to Limoges, and this one moves to Lyon, and this one moves to Berlin, and this one there, so you already have that's how the Jews did it. And the result is that now this couple, when he's 18, 19, 20 years old, something like that, after he learned the business, and that's already becoming a man in those days, and she'll be a woman, so they'll have 150, okay, or take a little off, 120, 130, and with that, they'll start their business. They'll, go into the jewelry business or the other business, and the cycle repeats itself. Because when they'll have children, then they'll have to do the exact same thing, won't they? What I just described you is how, what you call Shani Yidden, middle-class Jews or whatever, did it for hundreds and hundreds of years over and over and over again. Because there was no choice. There was no unemployment insurance, there was no social security, there was no social safety net, there was no reliable banking system or anything like this. So what do you do? And I repeat, I'm talking about good parents. Now, everything is great, but you never know how life turns out. And so if you have 2 kids that get married when they're 12, who's to say that he's going to turn out to be the breadwinner? You understand? At 12 years old, you don't know. It might turn out by the time he's 15, 16, 17 years old, he's a real jerk. Right? Any money you give him, he'll blow it in 5 minutes. Maybe he's a nice guy, but he's a ganzelo yuslach when it comes to business. Right? I'm not talking somebody who's an abusive this and that and that. I'm talking about that all. Not you know and I know. Not everybody is successful as a business person. Correct? You say like this, but his father was a businessman when I did like this. You know and I know. That doesn't mean anything. How many people do we know that the father built a boat? When I grew up, I saw this right and left when I was growing up in Forest Park. The father came over from Europe. He couldn't read English. He built up a whole business. He sent his son to business school. The father died. He left it. A kid 6 months later was down the drain. Right? Very common. So my point is like this. So here you have the $120,000, $130,000. They're both 18, 19, or 20 years old. And it turns out like this. She's got it, and he doesn't. Right? What are you going to do? Are you going to say like this is a male-dominated culture, and so the man will be the better? They can't afford to play games like that. You just can't afford it. You could, God forbid, lose your principal, and then you're doomed. Where are you going to get that from? You understand what I'm saying? And so the result's going to be, however they, deck it out, however they decorate it, she's the breadwinner. Right? At the end of the day, whatever he does, but the bottom line, she's the breadwinner. We have in Ashkenaz it's very fascinating, many records of women who, by the time they grew up, they were running whole businesses, they were CEOs, they were miniature Gracia Mendes types, not like her, but miniature thing. We have the women who were running caravans and organizing extensive commercial trade and all the rest of it, because she turned out she's got a head for it, and she got the knack for it. And so wait a second. But he said like this, but I sit at the head of the table, right? That's true. He said because this is the 11th century, so there's not a women's liberation movement at that time. He'll sit at the head of the table, but where's the seat of the power? He's going to make the kiddush, right? But you understand what I'm saying, okay? And these things are very fascinating, because what you're seeing over here is a very powerful social reality. I repeat, there are two dynamics that can be identified over here. One is the social reality of living in a very small Jewish community in which everybody needs everybody, and everybody automatically is chashuv, right? And then you have the second reality, which is the economic reality, okay? Which was not uncommon at all at that time. This would be particularly true if you're talking about a situation in which he's in learning. So then what does that mean? This is the period of Rashi and the Bali Tosis. He could be learning for 10, 20 years. So who's making the living, right? Now, if he's very talented, like, for example, Rabbenu Tam, you can be a Baal Tosis and also a millionaire because you just have a great knack for investments. He was a fantastic investor. There are people like that. I'm sure right now in the Kola somewhere there must be some guy who's great in investment, but I don't know. There aren't too many of them, or at least they don't tell anybody about it. We have many records, whether it's in the non-Jewish records or in the responsive literature among the Jews, of all these women, as I say before, who become big business big shots. And you'll be surprised that many historians are of the opinion that the primary Jews who were involved in the money lending business in Ashkenaz in the 10, 11, and early 1200s are women. The husbands are more in the mercantile business. So the situation is one in which, you can understand, the situation is one in which he goes off to do merchant stuff, the imports, the exports, and contact, whatever. She stays home and actually lends the money out to the bishop, the church, the duke, the count, or stamazai the shkotzim. That's what it says. The local people over there, and we find very often in the responsive literature that they're always worried. They say, in other words, they don't like at all. To use a Baltimore metaphor, they don't like at all that this Jewish lady is going all the times in the slum to collect the rent. That's in the Middle Ages, to go into these towns and villages and everybody's drunk and, whatever law and order and morals were in those days, and sometimes they spend 2 weeks, 3 weeks over there collecting everything that's coming to them. It must have been tough, right? And yet that's the reality of life. You understand? And don't tell me that there aren't consequences to it. And so what we end up seeing is a very traditional society, which prides itself on being an extremely traditional society and which doesn't change, but does. In other words, the images, we don't change. The reality is that they do. And so you find all kind of interesting things. Now, Rashi's daughter is a legend. I'm always laughing at that because it's a very interesting reality over there, but nobody knows the reality. They always know the legends. They always say Rashi's daughter did this, that we're filming, and all the rest of it. To my knowledge, there's no basis for any of that. There's no sources. But the real reality, though, is more interesting because it's more widespread and it's more real. You already find, for example, that, to take one example, and I'll give you several, There's a whole debate on women, should they make a bracha on a mitzvah that says it's mangroma, correct? A time-bound mitzvah, which a woman is not required to perform, and she doesn't have to. She could be at home and with the family and all the rest of it. But what if she wishes to? Well, is that really fulfilling the mitzvah told you make a bracha on it or not? The Sephardic tradition down till today is they do not, because it's not a mitzvah that the women have to do. The Ashkenaz tradition, already starting from the time of Rabbenu Tam, is if a woman wants to be, then she can make a bracha too. You see the difference. You find that in the Talmudic time, the men are reclining at the Seder, right? Because only the Chashva people or something like that, the Rebbe and the Talmud, this and that and the other. By the time you get to Ashkenaz and Middle Ages, many people are familiar with the Raviyah, which is quoted by the Ramah. The Raviyah is living in Germany exactly at this time. Noshim shalona chashuv v'sein. Our wives are all chashuv, therefore they all recline at the Seder. Because I'm telling you again, he's the guy making Kiddush, and she's the CEO. He's telling us he's reclining, she's not reclining. Doesn't make any sense. We find now for the first time that in Ashkenaz women want to fast on Erev Pesach if they're b'chorban. Okay? The origin of this is in the Aguda, and I don't mean the synagogue over here, I mean the Sefer, the Aguda, right? Which is in Germany, smack in the middle of Ashkenaz. During this page, we find these wonderful stories, if you know where to look, in the Maril, who's Mr. Ashkenazic Minhag. He lived a little bit later, but he's the faithful recorder of the Ashkenazic Minhagim. That's what you and I practice over here, and in the Maril is the whole thing about women who want to wear talis cotton, wear tzitzis. Now, mind you, this is not outside, right? This is different than the 21st century. This is not a in your face thing. It's a talis cotton under the thing. But what is that? This Namaril talking. He says, Amar Mari Segel Glo Nehir Be'enov. He doesn't approve, and he was a big rabbi in the Rhineland, exactly what we're talking about in Ashkenaz in the 15th century. He doesn't like the fact that a lot of women, you find, will now want to take on the mitzvah tzitzis. So the people ask them, if you're against it, then how come there's this big rebbe in Bruna in your town, in Mainz, and she wears tzitzis, a talis cotton, and you don't say anything? She wears it all the time. Beheshiv, and the Marel answered, and he was the big the guy at that time, if I tell her, she won't listen to me. Therefore, therefore better she should be a shogeg. She thinks she's doing the right thing, and therefore I do it, I'll make a whole fight and a whole scene. What are you talking about? He's the big guy, right? He was the big halachic authority, and he was a big halachic authority. And she wants to, and why does she want to do it? And I'll tell you again, you never hear about this Maris Bruna. It's not like I said before, that she's trying to launch a movement or anything like this. That's the very interesting side. There doesn't seem to be that modern ideological movement-oriented component. It's people on their own, as a matter of personal religiosity and as a matter of chashivas, of higher self-esteem image. They say, I'm somebody also, and I want to do this because this will make me closer to God, or I don't know what. Of course, these are minor examples of manifestation of the increased position socially and otherwise of the women in the Ashkenaz, when this is not happening in any of the Jewish community at all throughout the whole Middle Ages, or even afterwards. The most important and concrete of these are the famous Rabbenu Gershoms, right? Where we have Rabbenu Gershom, who we know very, very little about. I tried to explain it last week. And obviously he was a big person in the late 900s, and he died in the early 1000s, in 1025 or so. And he left almost nothing in writing except this image of an extremely venerated gadol of the type that I was saying before. If Rabbenu Gershom says he died Meyer Wizenfeld, that's it. Don't tell me anything else. And he leaves behind a tradition which isn't put into print until a couple hundred years later, that in his time he issued cherems. He issued prohibitions. Now who's he? I think I mentioned last week, in the Jewish law, no one has the right to issue rules that apply to everyone after the Talmud. There's no drabbanans nowadays. Even if all the rabbis got together today and said, this is, usher and this is mutter, it would not have the force of law. It would have the force, perhaps, at the most, of social pressure, which I'm not deprecating. It's very, very powerful. But it doesn't have the force of law, and they would never claim it. This is a principle of Jewish law. There are no drabbanans after Chasimas HaTalmud. Okay? So no one has the right to say, for example, you can do this or you can't do this and you have to do it. And yet, in spite of everything I told you before, he does it. And he said, but you can't. This is Ashkenaz. Wake up and smell the coffee. Right? And you see, nobody has to listen to it. Nobody has to listen to it, but they all listen to it. Because if it's the land of the Minhagim and all the rest of it, they're going to listen to it. And he issued he's reputed to have issued a bunch of famous rulings. The most two that affect the women in terms of the status and are very practical is the prohibition of divorcing a wife against her will. That's already a big legal step. And secondly, the prohibition of polygamy, which is an even bigger legal step. Okay? I mean, these are huge legal steps. And, nobody knows why, and nobody does this. Therefore, I'm sure, perhaps like I did when I was a kid, you read the Marcus Lehman book about how Rabbenu Gershom had two wives and didn't get along with each other, and that's a legend. That's a bunch of baloney, right? He didn't just do something because he didn't, two wives couldn't get along. Therefore, he said he's going to issue a cherem and all the rest of it. The Marcus Lehman books are very nice, but they're teenage novels. That's what they are. I'm serious. I mean this in the best sense of the word. Marcus Lehman was an important Orthodox rabbi in Germany in the 19th century, and he published a newspaper that was like the Jewish press at that time at a higher level, and it was the sole source of Jewish content for vast numbers of Jews, particularly in South Germany. In Eastern Europe, they used to make fun of it. They say they get the newspaper and they read the Torah thought for the week, in the parsha, and they make a Rabbanan Kaddish. But that actually did happen, and it's not something to be mocked at. This was the reality of it, and he knew very well that young people need something to read on Shabbos, and therefore he used to put novels in. But it's not the reality of it. We don't know what the reasons are, but in any event, it's landmark legislation without question, and it's only possible within this context of Ashkenaz where they kind of make up their own way of doing rules, even though it doesn't conform with the Talmudic rules. Right? And my point is like this, people listen. And so, this radically changes the relationship between man and woman, husband and wife. It goes without saying. Think about what I'm about to say. It's kind of hard to talk about Eshes Chayil in the context of polygamy. At least that's what it seems to me. Right? I mean, here we make a whole big deal of Eshes Chayil Miyim, so all the rest of it. Even though it is true that Shlomo Melech had 1,000 wives. I don't know, I haven't figured that one out yet. But for you and I, right, it's hard to talk about Eshes Chayil, and we'll see it in a few minutes, iconographic, Ashkenazic representations of the Eshes Chayil. You don't find this, it's to my knowledge, coming out of the Sephardic and the Arabic Jewish context, because who's the Eshes Chayil? Right? Maybe it's the Neshei Chayil or something like that. But when all said and done, it's a legislation or whatever you want to call it with very remarkable kinds of long-term consequences. Okay, and so even though, as I say before, there's not exactly a movement or anything like this that we can identify, but I know what I see. And I know it's all happening in the 10, 1100s, 1200s in Ashkenaz, and I know it's not happening anywhere else, and I'm not stupid. Okay? And neither should you be. And really, when you contrast this with the contemporary Jewish communities in Sfarad and Spain, which are perhaps more highly educated in secular studies, and yet the position of the woman is extremely much more inferior over there, for a variety of reasons, as I'll explain in a moment. And if you do in the Arab countries, I mean, forget it. No, there's North Africa, the Middle East, and all the rest of it. It's just, what can I tell you? The Ashkenaz marks itself off early on in its career as a kind of different sort of Jewish community, particularly in its organized set of relationship between the husband and the wife and the genders and all the rest of it. It's really kind of interesting. Now, by the way, Rabbenu Gershom he's reported to have issued many takanas. The Cherem, again, that's only two. Many of you have heard, for example, that he's reputed to have made the prohibition not allowed to read someone's mail. Okay? Which speaks pretty bad about Ashkenaz Jews at that time. If they had to make a rule, you can't read someone else's mail. It's like the what do you call it? The what am I thinking of? In the small towns, the lady with the runs the telephones, listening to everybody's conversation. All the yentas But nevertheless, he makes such a tahana. He also, for example, has all kind of rules about you're not allowed to remind, you're not allowed to tell somebody who wasn't from you used to not to be from. Now, that has a specific context in the time of Rabbenu Gershom, and that is because he lived in Mainz, on the Rhineland, in the second half of the 900s and the early 1000s. As far as we know, it's hard to get the exact records on this. There weren't any persecutions of the Jews at that time, but with one big exception. In the year 1012, in Mainz, some Jew shot his mouth off and had a debate with a priest, and he did too good of a job on it, and he persuaded the priest. The priest then converted to Judaism, right? And then all hell broke loose, because the priest had no discretion. After all, why should he? He wasn't Jewish until now. Therefore, he wanted to flaunt it to everybody else. This really ticked off the authorities. Next thing you know, the Jews are expelled from Mainz. There was violence connected with it. We don't know all the details, but we're told in many sources that Rabbenu Gershom's own son was seized by them and became a Christian. That's right. And we're told, and again, it's hard, I want to emphasize for the 15th time, it's hard to get the accuracy of these things because they're all based on one line here or half a line there. We're also told that he sat Shiva for the son, which is the origin of the practice that you've heard of, that if someone's kids convert or marry out, the parents sit Shiva on it. It's not in the Talmud or anything, they say it's what Rabbenu Gershom did. But again, there are other versions of that line for specialists who want to go into that sort of question. So it's a very interesting period over here, and therefore it's not surprising that someone like a father or someone like that, if a kid came back or someone else came back to Judaism after having converted out, you're not allowed to insult them and say, Zachor Masech HaRishonim, remember what you were yesterday. You understand? Now that means if he had to legislate against it, what does that tell you? Everybody was throwing it in the face. If he had to legislate against it, every time the guy walked in the shul, it made him feel like dirt. You see? This is a very important precedent because Rashi will, in the aftermath of the First Crusade, in the late 1000s, 1098, 1099, and thereabouts, reissue the same ruling. There will be many Jews, as we'll see, who for one reason or another do not become martyrs, do succumb, will convert. And then when the violence subsides and the coast is clear, as I'll try to explain, they were permitted to come back to Judaism. And all hell breaks loose. Because you want to come back into shul? You're the only two guys that survived the town. And you now are going to take over the Jewish property of the community? You traitors and all the rest of it. You can understand that. My husband was killed because of Kiddush Hashem. My wife did this and that and the other, and you want to do it? And Rashi will once again say, but Rabbenu Gershom said that you can't tell a person like this, anybody who wants to come back sincerely has to be taken back on there. But I'll tell you again, anytime you have to legislate something like that, it's a lot of tension, right? I mean, I don't care what he says. It's a lot of tension. I want to have some fun for a minute, and that is, and thanks to Howard, I can do this. I saw the other day in a very fine book from Professor Grossman, medieval art, reproductions from old machzors from the time of Rashi to Tosas and a little bit after the old Ashkenaz. And you can't, I'm going to show it to you, but before I say, I want to preface it with something. You never know how totally accurate these things are because you don't know who the artist is. We're talking about illuminated manuscripts. And yet, it's fascinating in terms of the relationship, men and women. In Ashkenaz, as opposed to elsewhere, because you don't find these reproductions only in Ashkenaz and in Italy. Okay? We don't have any, to the best of my knowledge, from Egypt and from, North Africa and Iraq and places like that. But you get them out of Ashkenaz, you get them out of Italy, and that's most likely Ashkenazic Jews that moved to Italy. Okay? So, for example, take a look at this. Here, I don't know if you can see it. I'll try my best. This is from a Haggadah, from the Middle Ages. And what you see over here, I guess it's not easy to tell, is a whole bunch of people at a Seder. Here's a man, there's two women. Yeah, that's good. Here's a man, there's two women. Here's a man learning with a woman at the Seder. In other words, everybody's got a Haggadah, and they're all sitting the same way, and they're arguing. And here's a bunch of men, a bunch of women at the Seder table, all in the same family, and they're arguing over the Haggadah. You understand? In other words, it's not that the women are in the kitchen or something like this. as it would have been perhaps at the Rambam Seder or something like that, right? Because he's Spanish and he's Arabic. But instead, it's and this is a Haggadah. There's if you look closely, you look close enough, you'll see every second, third person is a woman, and every woman has a book, and she's arguing with the man. So in other words, they're arguing over the 4 sons. They're arguing over the meaning of the Manishtana and all that sort of thing. Let's go to the next one. Here again, here's a representation from Pirkei Avos, probably from a sitter, as all I can tell, from Ashkenaz. Obviously, this guy had no trouble making pictures of people. So there's Moses getting the Torah on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets. You can see that, right? And here's the Jewish people standing at the bottom. It's mixed seating. If you look closely, it's men and women sitting at the bottom. That's an Ashkenazic reproduction. It wouldn't even today be an Ashkenazic reproduction. And now you won't find this in the Hamodia or the Yeteg, because they won't show anything. But you have it in something coming from the 11 and 1200s. Let's go to the next one. This is Miriam dancing at the well. There's the tambourine and the others. You know what they split as Oz Yashir, Tikach Miriam Hanaviyah. And I can't, they have Miriam as a maiden over here, because you'll see later on all the Jewish women and all the other pictures, the hair is covered. But here not. And once again, you see the representation of the women iconically. These are icons. This is really the art. Represented in a very positive fashion. There's that picture of Moshe. Let's go to the next one. Once again, you have Ozbrov, Nisim Hiflesa. You know, this is the poem you say at the end of the Seder, Hallel Nirtzah. You know, right? Correct? And when you get to the end. And here again, if you look closely, here's the Seder, and here's the men and the women. So first of all, it's mixed seating. It's not like the Ger Hasidim. And second of all, you see, look at this. Here's 2 people, probably husband and wife. She has her head covered, of course. And they're both battling away, battle of the text. He's got a Haggadah, she's got a gun, and they're arguing over here. Now, the author that in this book says they're debating the laws of Passover. That's modern, postmodern, politically correct kind of talk. That's actually not true. But it doesn't matter, right? Because the point is that when you're somebody's, you look at the beautiful artwork, by the way. You know, imagine what a Haggadah like that's worth nowadays. But you see, once again, this is very Ashkenazic. Okay, there again is the women and the men, the brothers and the sister, husband, all arguing over what's going on. They're all flaunting their Haggadahs at each other. In other words, the wise son is the good one, and the bad son is the right one. Let's move on. Here is I just threw this in. Here's a chasana. Watch this. This is a man, right? First of all, he's got the long hair like that. Second of all, he's got a shtreimel. I thought that's the Jewish hat. Long ago. This is Yekish, so you know how they do it even today with the talus over the thing. You're all familiar with that. She has, you think this is Hungarian Hasidim, this is from Ashkenaz. Even in this culture, the bride goes with the face covered. You know that? You know what I'm talking about, right? Where they wear something over the face, and that's typical, right? Even though, as I say before, it may by the way, how old is this guy? I mean, he's a young teenager of some kind or another. This is not an old man, okay? The bride has a face covered. 5 years from now, she may be the CEO. That's the interesting fact. There must be the rabbi, I guess. Let's move on to the next one. This is my favorite picture. I wanted to colorize it. Maybe we'll bring it in next time. Howard has it in there. If you can see closely, this is a family just before Pesach. Here's a father in the house. If you look closely, the woman's hair is not covered because she's in the house. And that's Ashkenazic. Okay? Outside the house is one thing, in the house is different. That's his candle for B'dikas Chametz. You see that? There's the little kid helping him with holding the what am I talking about? To put the chametz in the tray, the dish, right? This is in time a little bit after Rashi. So here's the father with the candle and all the rest of it. He's a French Jew, so you don't see a yarmulke. The mother is washing the ceiling. It didn't start today, right? This is Pesach. You know the old story. Get out of my house because I don't want to hear what the Shulchan Aruch can make the house treif. Correct? She's washing the ceiling because you take these things seriously. The daughter is Cinderella. She's washing the floor. Okay? Right? And there's your domestic scene before over here. what I'm trying to show you is if you know how to find the artwork and if you know how to read them and you know a little bit about the historical context of them, they tell you a lot. Okay? Now, one cautionary note before we depart, this is, I think that's, it's one more, oh yeah, this is again, this is really Ashkenazic. This is the Eishes Chiel. She's sitting on the throne, and as the pasuk says, the father and the sons all praise her. Okay? And there she is, of course, with her, what do you call it, it's not a tickle or whatever. And so in other words, she is the mother. You're not going to have this picture in Sfarad, right? Or at least you'll have to have a row of seats, okay? Because there's not one wife. You understand? So no, I'm serious. So even the artistic renditions of this are reflective of the social reality, which is just fascinating when you think that we're talking not only pre-modern, we're talking 1,000 years ago, okay? When the mores are being formed in all kind of interesting ways, this is the community that's going to be hit with a ton of bricks when the Crusades start. Okay, let me move on a little bit over here. Let me say one very important point about the contrast between Ashkenaz and Sfarad, and that is the Ashkenazi Jews were really culturally insular, and the Jews in Spain were less so. Just to juxtapose the position of Rashi on the one hand and Rambam is to make the case. The Rambam, of course, as we all know, was a total gadol in Torah. He wrote the Mishnah, you don't need me to tell you that. But at the same time, as everybody knows, was an accomplished physician and a philosopher and all the rest of that. Rashi, by contrast, and again, I'm using these as typical examples of their culture, was the opposite of what I just said. Rashi was a rabbi, period. He learned Shas, he learned Chumash, and things like this from Greek and things like that. He number one, he didn't know, and as far as we can know, he didn't want to know. Okay? He didn't bother anybody. He did his thing, and there you have it. Now, because the Aristotelian philosophical tradition was so strong in Spain, and for that matter in Italy as well, the results are the opposite of what you think. Because in medieval philosophy, particularly in Aristotelianism, and particularly the version of Aristotelianism that becomes popular in Europe in the Middle Ages, the women are always down. Aristotle always has bad things to say about women. She represents the inferior side of things. She represents all the negative out there in life. And there are many philosophical proofs for this. Okay, Aristotle is not there. If you show me today a women's liberal who's an Aristotelian, that's an oxymoron. You understand? And this very heavily colors. If you ever see what the Rambam said, I know they call it Yeshiva Rambam and all the rest of it. I'm always laughing when they do that, because if you ever see what the Rambam writes, for example, about women, it's very deprecating. Okay? And it's interesting in that regard. And same thing with the Ralbag and all these other intellectuals who are, they're always into Homer and Surah and who represents the inferior and the superior types and all the rest of it. Adrabah, many of these allegorically interpret the Adam and Eve story as an allegory to show you that this represents, Adam represents the positive side and Eve represents the tempting and the negative side. So because of that, it's contrary to what you think. The Western culture militated against an improvement in the position of the women vis-a-vis the men in the Jewish society as well as in the general society. By contrast, in a sort of unexpected way, because in Ashkenaz, this simply didn't exist. This is not Provence, and this is not Italy, and this is not Spain. This is northern Germany, where all these people are doing is making a living and working hard at that. And when you have time, they do the Gemara, the Chumash, and that sort of business. So then it's strictly falling back on totally Jewish sources. In Jewish sources in the Talmud, you can find statements for everything. And as you see, the statements that come to be valorized in the 10, 11, 1200s, these are the ones that are more in the favor of Noshim Chashuvos. It's just kind of interesting when it emerges out of that sort of thing. I'll conclude over here, because the hour is late, I'll conclude by one very important point, and that is that this will perhaps help us understand a very fascinating phenomenon of what's going to be in the First and Second Crusades, and that is the leading role of Jewish women in the Jewish response to the Crusades. If you read the Chronicles, especially the Jewish ones, almost always, not always, but very often, you find the woman is the first one to commit suicide, to jump in the water, to kill her children, to spit on the Crusaders, to reject this and the other. No, they have this super enthusiastic attitude, and they're often the first anything connected with suicide, which is the reverse of one would think. Okay, and the truth of the matter is, you're falling back upon old Talmudic precedents, but they're just agadatos, so you don't know how to deal with it. But we're not dealing with a question in which, obviously, when there's a crusade, you don't ask a shiloh what to do. This is what people just did, you see? And one is reminded very much, and perhaps I'll conclude with this story tonight, even though it's all this stuff is not a pick-upper, but tomorrow morning is already Shavas of Talmud, so it'll be appropriate. The main story of suicide in the Talmud is about the 400 boys and girls leaving after the Churban by Hashem, after the destruction of the Second Temple, which very briefly reads, Ma'aseh B'Dalet Meis Yolon V'Yolodos, there were 400 boys and girls, Shenishbu L'Kolon, that were captured and were going to be sent to lives of prostitution in Rome. Hirgishu B'Yatzim Lomei Misbakshim, they understood themselves, even though they were young, where they're destined. Amru, and they said, Imanu Tov Bayam, on a boy L'Chayim Habo, if we jump over and kill ourselves by drowning in the sea, will we get resurrected? We have Tchias HaMesim? So the point is that one of them said, I can tell from a verse in the Bible that the answer is yes, that if they do it for this reason, for a noble cause, to save themselves from the lives of shame, then they will get Tchias HaMesim. Listen closely. So all the girls jumped in. Don't say the boys did. So all the women jumped in. Then the boys said, there's a Kal V'chomer. If they did it, then we should too, and then they jump in. So the story itself, which is in the Talmud, written long before the period of the Crusades, is the one in which, very interesting, if you pay attention to the details, the girls are the ones, why the girls are the ones who jump in? You understand? And once again, you see, long preceding the Ashkenazic even, but intensified by everything I hope that I tried to delineate tonight, the very important role of the women in the communities, and the super willingness to lead the charge on Kiddush Hashem, even though if one wants to look at this calmly and dispassionately and discuss the question of whether or not halachically this is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, there's a whole ganze long discussion of that, but that is not what happened in 1096. You understand? The long and involved discussions and all the rest of it is not the way it goes. Instead, it goes the way it goes, and then that becomes the precedent, and then that becomes part of the minhag. Good night.